On the night of March 10th, 1987, in a quiet car park behind a South London pub, a man was murdered in a way that left no doubt about intent. An axe was driven into his head with such force that it remained lodged there as if meant to send a message. The victim was Daniel Morgan, a private investigator, a father, and a man who had been digging into secrets powerful people did not want exposed. What followed should have been one of Britain's most urgent murder investigations. Instead, it became one of the most disturbing examples of institutional failure in modern British history. For more than 30 years, Daniel Morgan's killer has never been brought to justice, not because the truth was unreachable, but because it was repeatedly blocked. Evidence vanished. Leads were ignored. Witnesses were silenced. Investigations collapsed, not once, but again and again. This was not simply a case of police mistakes. It was a case of protection. As the years passed, it became clear that Daniel Morgan's murder was entangled in something far bigger: corruption within the Metropolitan Police, criminal networks operating in plain sight, and a media culture willing to cross legal boundaries to obtain information. 5 separate investigations failed. Careers were damaged. Reputations were defended at all costs, and a family was left waiting for justice that never came. In 2021, after decades of denials, an independent panel reached a conclusion so serious it shook public confidence. The Metropolitan Police had become institutionally corrupt, not because every officer was corrupt, but because the institution repeatedly chose secrecy over truth. This is not just the story of how Daniel Morgan died. It is the story of how justice was obstructed, delayed, and denied. This is the story of a murder that exposed the dark underbelly of British policing. This is the Daniel Morgan murder. Daniel Morgan was not a man who sought attention. He worked in the background, in the quiet spaces where information was traded and secrets were kept. Born in 1944, Morgan built a life in South London, where he became known as a dependable private investigator, careful, persistent, and discreet. He wasn't interested in sensational cases or public recognition. His work focused on uncovering facts, following paper trails, and answering questions other people could not. Those who knew him described Daniel Morgan as principled, sometimes stubborn, and deeply serious about his work. He believed that the truth mattered, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. That belief would ultimately place him in danger. In the early 1980s, Morgan co-founded a private detective agency called Southern Investigations. Among his business partners was a man named Jonathan Rees. On the surface, the partnership appeared productive. The agency took on clients ranging from individuals to corporations, handling cases involving surveillance, fraud, and background checks. But beneath that professional facade, the partnership was deteriorating. Daniel Morgan had begun to notice troubling patterns: jobs that blurred legal lines, relationships that felt too close, and information that seemed to be flowing freely between criminals and police officers. Morgan was increasingly uncomfortable with what he was seeing. According to those closest to him, Daniel Morgan started asking questions about corruption, about illegal surveillance, and about police officers who appeared willing to trade information for money. He was no longer just a private investigator working routine cases. He was becoming a man who knew too much. In the weeks leading up to his death, Morgan reportedly confided in friends that he had uncovered serious wrongdoing. He spoke of evidence that could expose corruption within the Metropolitan Police. More importantly, he made it clear that he intended to act on what he knew. For Daniel Morgan, silence was not an option. By choosing to pursue the truth, he unknowingly placed himself at the center of a dangerous web, one involving criminals, corrupt officers, and powerful interests determined to protect themselves. and in March of 1987, that pursuit would cost him his life. By the afternoon of March 10, 1987, Daniel Morgan was already under strain. Those who saw him that day later recalled a man who appeared distracted, preoccupied by something he could not share openly. Whatever Daniel Morgan had uncovered, it was weighing heavily on him. That evening he arranged to meet his business partner, Jonathan Rees, at the Golden Lion pub in Sydenham, South London. It was not an unusual meeting location, but this time the circumstances were different. Relations between the two men had deteriorated, and the meeting was reportedly tense from the start. Witnesses would later describe raised voices and visible frustration. This was not a casual conversation between colleagues. It was a confrontation. What was said inside the pub has never been fully established, but investigators believe Daniel Morgan confronted Rees about information he had discovered. Information involving criminal activity and improper connections with police officers. Shortly before closing time, Daniel Morgan left the pub alone. He walked toward the rear car park, a poorly lit area bordered by fencing and buildings that offered little visibility from the street. It was a route he had taken before. But on this night, someone was waiting. Sometime after 11 p.m., Daniel Morgan was attacked. The weapon used was an axe, heavy, deliberate, and unmistakably personal. The blow was delivered with such force that the blade embedded itself deep into his skull. There were no signs of a struggle, no attempt to steal his wallet or belongings. This was not a robbery gone wrong. This was an execution. When Daniel Morgan's body was discovered later that night, the brutality of the killing sent shockwaves through the local community. For detectives, the message was clear. The victim had known his killer, or killers. And yet, despite the obvious significance of the crime, the investigation that followed would begin to unravel almost immediately. From the moment Daniel Morgan's body was discovered, the case demanded absolute precision. Instead, it was marked by mistakes, some accidental, others far more troubling. The murder scene behind the Golden Lion pub was not secured properly. Potential evidence was exposed to contamination. The axe, an unusually distinctive weapon, was mishandled, compromising forensic opportunities that could have been critical in identifying the killer. Witnesses who were in or around the pub that night were not interviewed promptly. Some were never interviewed at all. Others would later claim that their statements were ignored or altered. Within days, attention turned toward individuals close to Daniel Morgan, particularly those within his professional circle. But despite strong suspicions, key figures were not treated with the urgency normally expected in a murder investigation. Even more concerning were allegations that sensitive information about the case was being leaked almost immediately. Details known only to investigators appeared in the hands of those who should not have had access to them. As weeks passed, the investigation stalled. Leads that could have been followed were quietly dropped. Surveillance opportunities were missed. Lines of inquiry involving police corruption were avoided altogether. Years later, senior officers would acknowledge that the original investigation had been seriously flawed. But by then, the damage was irreversible. The first inquiry collapsed without charges. For Daniel Morgan's family, this was not just a setback. It was the beginning of a long and painful pattern. Each failed attempt to find justice would be followed by silence, denial, and defensiveness from the very institution tasked with solving the crime. Behind closed doors, however, a darker reality was taking shape. The problem was not simply incompetence, it was interference. As the initial investigation faltered, attention increasingly focused on one man, Jonathan Rees, Daniel Morgan's business partner. Rees was not an outsider to the police world. He had cultivated relationships with serving officers, particularly within the Metropolitan Police. These connections, investigators would later learn, gave him access to information that ordinary citizens could never obtain. In the days following the murder, Reese was arrested and questioned. But the process raised immediate concerns. Interviews were brief. Follow-up inquiries were limited. Opportunities to challenge inconsistencies in his account were missed. Despite serious suspicions, Reese was released without charge. Over the years, Reese would be arrested again, only for cases to collapse before reaching trial. Evidence that could have been used against him was compromised. Witnesses who were prepared to testify later withdrew their statements. Some claimed they had been intimidated. Others said they no longer trusted the system to protect them. Behind the scenes, allegations mounted that police officers had actively interfered with the investigation. Files were mishandled. Surveillance operations were improperly authorized. Critical intelligence was either ignored or deliberately suppressed. One prosecution attempt failed spectacularly when it emerged that police misconduct had contaminated the case to such an extent that a fair trial was no longer possible. Judges were left with no choice but to halt proceedings. Each collapse reinforced a devastating conclusion. The system was shielding someone. For Daniel Morgan's family, the message was impossible to ignore. The problem was no longer just finding the killer. It was confronting a structure that appeared determined to protect itself. And with every failed arrest, justice slipped further away. By the early 1990s, the murder of Daniel Morgan was no longer just a cold case. It was a case haunted by its own failures. Over the next 2 decades, the Metropolitan Police would launch 5 separate investigations into Daniel Morgan's death. Each one was presented as a fresh start. Each one promised accountability. And each one ended the same way, without a conviction. The second investigation reopened lines of inquiry that should never have been abandoned. But by then, evidence had deteriorated. Memories had faded. Witnesses were increasingly reluctant to come forward. The third inquiry attempted to correct earlier mistakes, yet it quickly ran into the same obstacles. Officers encountered missing files, unexplained gaps in records, and intelligence that appeared to have been deliberately withheld. By the time the fourth investigation began, the case had become entangled with allegations far beyond murder. Claims of bribery, surveillance abuse, and corrupt relationships between private investigators and police officers could no longer be ignored. Even so, the pattern continued. Arrests were made, cases were prepared, and then, quietly, everything fell apart. In one of the most damaging moments, prosecutors concluded that the extent of police misconduct made it impossible to guarantee a fair trial. The case was abandoned, not because the evidence pointed away from guilt, but because it had been irreparably tainted. The fifth and final investigation ended in 2011. Once again, no one was held responsible. For Daniel Morgan's family, each failed inquiry deepened the wound. What they were witnessing was not the slow march of justice, but its repeated obstruction. The question was no longer who killed Daniel Morgan. It was why justice kept being denied. As the investigations continued to fail, another disturbing dimension of the Daniel Morgan case began to surface, one involving the British media. Journalists from the News of the World, at the time one of the most powerful tabloids in the country, were linked to individuals connected to the case. Information about Daniel Morgan, his family, and even the police investigations themselves appeared to be circulating illegally. Allegations emerged that journalists had paid private investigators for confidential information. Some of that information, investigators later discovered, could only have come from police databases. This raised a chilling possibility. Sensitive police intelligence was being sold to the press. At the center of these allegations were networks of private investigators who acted as middlemen, obtaining phone records, surveillance data, and personal information through unlawful means. Daniel Morgan's former business partner, Jonathan Reese, was repeatedly named in connection with these activities. Even members of Daniel Morgan's family would later learn that their phones may have been accessed without consent, adding another layer of violation to an already painful ordeal. The murder case had now become inseparable from a wider scandal involving phone hacking, bribery, and systemic abuse of power. What began as a single homicide had exposed a hidden ecosystem where police officers, private investigators, and journalists operated in mutual benefit. Yet once again, meaningful accountability proved elusive. Investigations into phone hacking resulted in some convictions, but the links back to Daniel Morgan's murder remained unresolved. The central question, whether corruption directly obstructed justice in his case, still had no official answer. That would change years later when public pressure finally forced the government to act. By the early 2010s, public trust in the handling of Daniel Morgan's murder had been severely eroded. Years of unanswered questions, collapsed prosecutions, and credible allegations of corruption left little confidence in internal police reviews. In 2013, following sustained pressure from Daniel Morgan's family and members of Parliament, the government established the Daniel Morgan Independent Panel. Unlike previous inquiries, this panel was not tasked with finding the killer. Its purpose was to examine why the investigations had failed and whether corruption played a role. For the next 8 years, the panel reviewed tens of thousands of documents, including police files that had never been made public. They examined decision-making at every stage of the case and assessed the conduct of officers across multiple investigations. When the panel finally published its report in 2021, its conclusions were unequivocal. The Metropolitan Police, the panel stated, had demonstrated institutional corruption. The report did not suggest that all officers were corrupt. Instead, it described a culture in which the protection of the institution's reputation took priority over accountability, transparency, and justice. The panel found repeated failures to disclose evidence, resistance to external scrutiny, and a pattern of defensiveness that prevented the truth from emerging. Crucially, it concluded that these failures likely contributed to the continued inability to bring Daniel Morgan's killer to justice. For the Morgan family, the findings were both validating and devastating. After decades of being dismissed, their concerns were finally acknowledged. But the report came with a painful reality. No new prosecutions would follow. The truth had been exposed. Justice, once again, remained out of reach. For Daniel Morgan's family, the murder was only the beginning of their ordeal. Year after year, they were forced to relive the crime, not through progress, but through failure. Each new investigation raised hope, only for it to be taken away once more. Promises were made behind closed doors, then quietly abandoned. The family encountered resistance at every turn. Requests for information were delayed. Key documents were withheld. At times, they felt as though they were being treated not as victims, but as obstacles. Despite this, they refused to be silenced. Daniel Morgan's brother, along with other family members, became relentless campaigners. They challenged official accounts, demanded transparency, and exposed contradictions that others were unwilling to confront. Their persistence kept the case alive when institutions seemed determined to let it fade. They were not asking for special treatment. They were asking for the same thing every family deserves: the truth. The emotional toll was immense. Decades passed without closure. Birthdays, anniversaries, and milestones were marked by the absence of justice. And yet, the family continued, driven by the belief that acknowledging the truth mattered, even if convictions never came. When the independent panel's report was finally released, the family described it as a moment of recognition, not resolution. It confirmed what they had said all along, that corruption had obstructed justice and that Daniel Morgan had been failed by the system meant to protect him. But recognition could not undo the years of suffering. Daniel Morgan remained a murder victim without a murderer, his name now inseparable from one of the gravest scandals in British policing history. The murder of Daniel Morgan remains officially unsolved. No one has been convicted. No one has been held criminally responsible for taking his life. And yet, few cases in British history have revealed more about the hidden workings of power. Daniel Morgan did not die in anonymity. His death exposed deep failures within the Metropolitan Police, failures that forced the country to confront uncomfortable truths about corruption, secrecy, and institutional self-protection. The independent panel's findings did not deliver justice in the traditional sense, but they did something almost as significant. They placed the truth on record. They confirmed that the repeated investigative failures were not inevitable, and they were not accidental. They were the result of choices. Choices to protect reputations instead of victims. Choices to suppress scrutiny rather than confront wrongdoing. Choices that allowed a murderer, or murderers, to walk free. For Daniel Morgan's family, the fight was never only about a conviction. It was about accountability, about ensuring that what happened to him could not be quietly erased or denied. Today, the case stands as a warning of what happens when institutions place themselves above the law, a warning of how justice can be delayed until it becomes impossible, and a reminder that corruption, left unchecked, destroys trust far beyond a single crime. Daniel Morgan set out to uncover the truth. In death, his case did the same. And until justice is finally served, his story will remain a question Britain has yet to fully answer.